The morning of the auction, there were 80 piglets nobody wanted. They were penned in the far corner of the county sale barn, the corner where they put the animals no one expected to sell. And they made a sound like a kettle left too long on the stove, a thin, continuous whistling that carried out over the gravel lot where the men stood drinking coffee from paper cups. The piglets were runts, most of them, the leftovers from 3 different farms that had culled their weak stock and hauled it here to be rid of it before the feed bills got worse. They were undersized and knock-kneed, their ribs showing through skin the color of dishwater, and several of them leaned against the pen rails because they did not have the strength to stand on their own. The auctioneer had tried to move them as a lot twice already and gotten no bid either time, and now he was letting them sit while he ran the fat hogs and the good gilts through, saving the runts for the end, the way you save the trash for the last trip to the burn barrel. That was when the woman walked up to the pen. She was not much more than 20, thin through the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket that had belonged to somebody bigger, and she stood at the rail and looked at the 80 piglets for a long time without saying anything. She did not point. She did not lean in. She just looked, the way a person looks at weather coming. And the men by the coffee urn noticed her the way men notice a stranger, which is to say completely while pretending not to at all. Harlan Dees, who owned the largest hog operation in the county and had culled a dozen of those very piglets himself that week, watched her over the rim of his cup and said, loud enough to carry, that somebody ought to tell the girl the free ones are out back. A couple of men laughed. She did not turn around. When the auctioneer finally got to the runt lot and asked for any bid at all, any bid, $1 a head to clear the pen, she raised one finger without raising her voice, and the auctioneer, startled, said sold, and the men laughed again, and Harlan Dees said to nobody in particular that she'd just bought herself 80 funerals. If you have ever been told that the thing you have, or the thing you are, isn't worth much, do me a favor and hit that like button and drop the name of your town or your city in the comments, because I read them, all of them, and I like knowing where in this wide country you're listening from. Now let's begin. Her name was Della Renner, and she had come back to the county in October, 4 months before the auction, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it belonged to her. Her grandfather had died in the spring, an old man named Emmett Renner, who had farmed the same ridge his whole life and had never once in Della's memory raised his voice, and the place had come to her because there was no one else it could come to. Her mother had left the county at 18 and had made it plain that she considered leaving the smartest thing she had ever done. And Della had grown up in 3 different apartments in 2 different states, moving whenever her mother's luck or her mother's man ran out, and the only steady thing in all of it had been the 2 weeks each summer she spent on the ridge with Emmett. She remembered those 2 weeks the way other people remember a good dream, in fragments that felt more real than the waking parts of her life. The smell of the barn, the weight of a bucket, the particular way her grandfather had of standing at a fence and saying nothing until he had seen everything there was to see. He had taught her that, though neither of them would have called it teaching. He had simply done it in front of her enough times that it had gotten into her. The habit of looking before acting, of trusting her own eyes over another person's hurry. When the lawyer's letter had found her in the city, working a register at a store that sold things nobody needed, she had read it twice and then given her 2 weeks' notice and driven the whole way in a truck that made a sound like it was composing its own obituary. The ridge was smaller than she remembered and larger, too, the way places from childhood always are, and the house had settled and the barn had held. There was pasture gone to brush and a hog lot standing empty, its concrete cracked but sound, and there was a spring that ran cold and clean out of the hillside the way it had run for longer than anyone could say. The first night she had slept in her grandfather's bed because it was the only bed with sheets, and she had lain awake listening to the house tick and settle around her and thought, with a calm that surprised her, that she was not going to leave. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She only knew she was going to stay and find out. She was not alone on the ridge, though it took her a few days to understand that fully. Down the road, in a narrow house with a metal roof, lived her great-aunt Verna, Emmett's older sister, a woman past 80 who had never married and had never in her life lived more than a mile from the place where she was born. Verna wore men's work pants and rubber boots and a canvas coat much like the one Della had taken from her grandfather's peg, and she wore them without any self-consciousness at all because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm and let her work. She spoke rarely, and when she did speak, she said exactly as much as the situation required and not one syllable more. And she had a way of finishing a conversation that felt less like rudeness than like a door closing gently in a house where every door had always been closed gently. Della went to see her the first week, walked down the road with a jar of the last honey from Emmett's pantry as a kind of offering, and Verna had taken the jar and looked at it and said only, "He kept bees." Della said yes, and Verna said, "Badly." And that had been most of the conversation. But Verna started coming up to the ridge after that, not every day but often, walking the fence lines with a slowness that was not weakness but economy, every step placed where it needed to go and nowhere else. She looked at the empty hog lot for a long time one afternoon in November, and Della, who had learned the value of not filling silence, waited. "Your grandfather ran hogs on that lot 40 years, Verna said finally. Della asked what kind. "The old kind," Verna said, "the kind nobody wants anymore." And then she had turned and walked back down the road, and Della had stood there looking at the cracked concrete and thinking about a phrase she did not yet understand. The old kind, the kind nobody wants anymore, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lives beneath it. She found the notebooks in December. She had been going through the house slowly, room by room, not because she was looking for anything, but because a house full of a dead man's belongings is a kind of conversation that has to be had. And in the bottom drawer of a bureau in the back bedroom she found a stack of composition books, the black and white marbled kind, held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when she touched it. There were more than 40 of them, one for nearly every year, and they were written in Emmett's small square hand, and they were not a diary. They were records, breeding records, feeding records, weather records, the dates of first frost and last frost going back decades, the weights of hogs at weaning and at slaughter, the prices he had gotten and the prices he had refused. She read them at the kitchen table over the course of several nights, understanding perhaps a third of what she read, and slowly a picture assembled itself. Her grandfather had not raised the fast pink hogs that filled the sale barn and the county's big operations. He had raised an old breed, a lard hog, a heritage line he had kept going for decades after everyone else had switched to the lean, fast-growing modern stock, and the notebooks were full of his stubborn defense of that choice, not in words of argument, but in columns of figures. The old hogs grew slow. They put on fat where the market wanted lean. They took nearly twice as long to reach weight, and they ate through the difference. And by every measure the feed store and the extension office and the men at the coffee urn used, they were a losing proposition, which was exactly why the modern operations had culled them and why the runts at the sale barn had been runts, the discarded ends of a discarded line. But in the margins of the last notebook, in the final year of his life, Emmett had written a note that Della read a dozen times before she understood it might be meant for her. "The fat is the flavor," he had written. "They will come back to it. Do not sell the line to a man who will cross it out." And beneath that, smaller still, as if he had run out of certainty or room, "Ask Verna what to feed them. She knows the acorn ground." Della carried that note down the road to Verna's house on a gray afternoon in the middle of December, the ground frozen hard enough to ring under her boots, and she read it aloud at Verna's kitchen table while the old woman listened without expression. When she finished, Verna was quiet for a while. long enough that Della thought she might not answer at all. Then Verna said, "Your grandfather was the only man in this county too stubborn to be wrong." She got up and poured 2 cups of coffee that neither of them had asked for and set one in front of Della, and she said, "People eat with their eyes now. They want it lean and pink and cheap, and they don't remember what a hog is supposed to taste like. But there's a few that remember, and more that would if somebody made it worth remembering." Della asked about the acorn ground, and Verna's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "Above the spring," she said, "where the white oaks stand. He used to run them up there in the fall, let them fatten on mast for 6 weeks before he brought them down. Cost him nothing, made the meat taste like nothing you ever bought in a store." She sipped her coffee. He tried to tell people. They laughed at him. She set the cup down. "You favor him," she said, which was not a compliment or an insult, but a fact offered for consideration. And it was, Della would come to understand, the closest thing to a blessing the old woman had. So when the sale barn ran its winter auction in February, and Della saw the 80 runts pinned in the corner, she was not looking at 80 funerals the way Harlan Dees was. She was looking at the last of the old line, or close enough to it. The culled and discarded ends of the very breed her grandfather had spent 40 years defending, gathered by accident into one pen because the modern world had no use for them. She had gone to the auction to buy a few good feeder pigs to start with, cautiously, the way a person with almost no money starts anything. Instead, she had raised one finger for 80. She paid $80, $1 a head, and she signed the paper with a hand that did not shake. And then she had to figure out how to get 80 half-starved piglets home in a truck built for hauling maybe 15. It took her 4 trips, the truck groaning and the piglets crying, and Harlan Dees watched the first trip pull out and called after her that she'd better dig the hole big enough for all of them at once, and the men laughed. And Della lifted a hand without turning around, a wave that could have meant thanks or could have meant something else, and drove up the ridge in the cold with a truck bed full of the animals nobody wanted. The first weeks nearly proved Harlan Dees right, and Della never pretended otherwise, not even to herself. The piglets came to her sick and starved and terrified, and 11 of them died in the first 10 days no matter what she did, and she buried them at the edge of the brush lot with a shovel that blistered her hands, and each small grave felt like a verdict. But she kept the notebooks open on the porch rail where she could see her grandfather's feeding notes, and she followed them like scripture, and she did not rush. She warmed the piglets in the barn under lamps she rigged from an extension cord, and she fed them small and often the way the notebook said, milk replacer first, and then a soft mash, and she sat with them in the evenings in the straw, because Emmett had written, more than once, that a hog that trusts you grows better than a hog that fears you, a claim the extension office would have called sentimental, and Della found to be simply true. Verna came up most days and looked at the piglets over the rail and said little, but she brought things, a sack of the right minerals one day, a jar of some dark tincture another day that she said was for scours, and that worked when nothing else had, and once, wordlessly, a second heat lamp that had been hanging in her own shed for 30 years. By the end of February, the dying had stopped. The remaining 69 piglets, and Della counted them every morning, had begun to fill out at the edges, their ribs softening under skin that had begun to take on color. And the thin kettle whistle sound they had made at the sale barn had given way to the low, contented grunting of animals that had decided provisionally to live. Della kept her own notebook now, a marbled composition book like her grandfather's, and she wrote in it every night at the kitchen table, the weights when she could get them, the weather, what she fed and how much, the small daily arithmetic of patience. She did not name them. She held that line, because Emmett's notebooks had warned against it in a single underlined sentence, "Do not name what you mean to eat," and she understood the wisdom of it. She almost held that line. There was one, a gilt with a crooked ear and an air of grave responsibility, who had a way of leaning against Della's leg while she filled the troughs. And Della found herself calling her crooked in her own head, and then out loud, and she wrote in the notebook, one page, that she had failed to keep the rule with exactly one animal, and that crooked would be kept back for breeding and not for meat, which she told herself made it allowed. Verna, when she heard the name, said only, "He named one too, every year." And that was the end of that discussion. By April, the pasture had greened, and Della turned the young hogs out onto it, and this was the first time she saw what her grandfather had meant about the difference between these animals and the fast pink stock that filled the county. The old hogs foraged. They rooted and grazed and worked the ground the way their ancestors had for 10,000 years, and they turned the brushy, neglected lot into something that began to look like managed pasture. And they did it while eating half the purchased feed a modern hog would have needed, because they were built to make their living off the land instead of off a bag. She moved them in the pattern the notebooks described, a section at a time, letting them work one patch and then shifting them to the next before they turned it to mud, and the ground responded. And Verna walked the fence line one afternoon in late April and looked at the hogs spread across the greening slope and said he'd have liked to see this. It was, from Verna, an enormous thing to say, and Della understood it as such, and neither of them made a production out of it. But the question that hung over everything, the question Della carried up the acorn ground and back down again, was the one Harlan Dees had shouted across the sale barn lot. What was she going to do with them? She had a growing herd of an unfashionable breed that took twice as long to finish and put on fat the market claimed it did not want, and every conventional measure of the business said the animals were worthless, said the ground was not worth the trouble, said that nothing useful ever came from nothing useful. She had her grandfather's note. The fat is the flavor. They will come back to it. It was not a business plan. It was a prophecy, and prophecies, she knew, are only as good as the person patient enough to wait them out. The first proof came from an unlikely direction, and it came in June. There was a young man named Cole who ran the kitchen at the only restaurant in the county seat that could be called a restaurant, a place in a renovated feed store on the town square that drew people down from the city on weekends. And Cole had grown up on a farm his family had lost and had gone away to cook in school and come back with ideas the county mostly regarded as foolishness. He had heard, the way things are heard in a small place, through the woman at the gas station who heard it from the man who delivered propane, that Emmett Renner's granddaughter was up on the ridge raising the old man's hogs, and one Saturday he drove up the gravel road and stood at the fence beside Della and looked at the herd for a long time, and then he said something no one else in the county had said. "Are those Ossabaws?" Della said she thought they were mostly, or close to it, that her grandfather had kept the line for 40 years and hadn't been particular about the paperwork. Cole said that if they were what he thought they were, and if they tasted the way he thought they would, he had been trying to buy meat like this for 3 years and having it shipped from 2 states away at a price that made his accountant weep. He asked if he could buy one when they were finished. Della said they wouldn't be finished until fall, after the acorns. Cole said the word acorns the way a man says the name of someone he has loved and lost, and he said he would wait, and he left his number written on the back of a receipt, and Della pinned it to the notebook. It was a small thing. It was 1 restaurant and 1 cook, and 1 hog not yet grown. But it was the first time since the sale barn that anyone had looked at her animals and seen worth instead of waste, and she wrote it in the notebook that night, June, Cole, 1 hog in fall, and underlined it once, the way her grandfather underlined things that mattered. Word did not travel fast because nothing on the ridge traveled fast, but it traveled. Cole told a chef he knew in the city, and the chef in the city was the kind of man other chefs listened to, and by August, before Della had sold a single animal, she had 4 inquiries written on scraps of paper pinned to the notebook cover, 3 restaurants and a family from the city who had eaten something at one of the restaurants and wanted to know where it came from. Della answered each of them the same way, plainly, that the hogs would be ready in October after they had fattened on the acorn ground, that she had a limited number, that the price would reflect the year it took to raise them. She did not haggle, and she did not oversell. When one of the city restaurants pushed her to commit to a monthly quantity she could not possibly supply, she said, "That's one approach," and did not commit, and the restaurant, to her surprise, came back a week later and took what she could offer instead. She was learning, slowly, that scarcity done honestly was worth more than abundance done cheap, and that the people who understood what she had did not need to be talked into it. Verna watched all this from the edges, and one evening in August, sitting on Della's porch with a glass of tea neither of them was drinking, she said, "You're doing it the way he did." Della asked what way that was. "Slow," Verna said. "Small. No debt. You let them come to you." She rocked once in the chair that had been Emmett's. "Everybody else in this county grows by borrowing money and getting big, and every 10 years the bank takes half of them. He never borrowed $1 he couldn't pay by Sunday." She blew Ket out at the hogs settling into the dusk on the far slope. "That's why the place is still here for you to come back to," she said, and that was the whole lesson, delivered without ceremony, and Della wrote it in the notebook that night in her own words. "Grow by demand, not by debt. Let them come to you." It was August, and the acorns were beginning to set in the crowns of the white oaks above the spring, and for the first time since February, Della let herself believe that the prophecy might hold. The turning of the leaves brought the acorns down, and in early October, Della moved the hogs up the acorn ground for the first time, driving them slowly up the old track her grandfather had used, and the animals seemed to know the way as if the knowledge lived in their bodies. Under the white oaks the ground was thick with mast, and the hogs spread out and put their noses down and began to eat, and they ate for 6 weeks the way the notebook said they should, and Della came up morning and evening to count them and to watch. And what she watched was a kind of transformation she had no words for and did not try to find words for. The hogs that had come to her as whistling runts in February were broad-backed and glossy now, moving through the leaf litter with the unhurried confidence of animals doing exactly what they were made to do, and the fat they laid down under the influence of the acorns was the fat her grandfather had written about, the fat the market claimed nobody wanted, and Della understood at last, standing in the cold, slanting light under the oaks, that the entire county had been wrong about the most important thing for 30 years, not because they were stupid, not because they were lazy, because they had stopped tasting. They had chased cheap and fast and lean for so long that they had forgotten what a hog raised right on ground like this could be, and her grandfather had never forgotten, and now she would not either. Cole came up in the middle of October to see the acorn ground because he did not quite believe her when she described it, and he stood among the oaks with the hogs moving around his legs, and he did not say anything for a long time. And then he said, in a voice gone rough, that he had read about this, about hogs finished on mast, in old books and in accounts of Spain and Italy, but that he had never in his life expected to stand in it in his own county. He bought the first hog that November, and Della delivered it to the restaurant on the square in the truck that still sounded like it was dictating its will, and Cole cut it and cooked it, and what happened after that was not something Della engineered or could have engineered. Cole put a single dish on his menu in December, one dish made from that one hog, and he did not advertise it and he did not explain it. He simply wrote the name of the ridge on the menu, Renner Ridge, the way a wine list writes the name of a place, and let the people who ordered it find out for themselves. And they told other people. That was the whole mechanism. There was no marketing, there was no brand, there was only the fact of the meat itself, which was so far beyond what people expected that they could not stop talking about it, And by the time the winter deepened and the year turned, Della had more inquiries than she had animals, restaurants, and families, and a butcher in the city who wanted to sell it at a counter. And she turned most of them down, not out of pride, but out of arithmetic, because she had 68 hogs and one gilt named Crooked kept back for breeding. And when they were gone until the next year's litters grew. And she was not going to promise what the ground could not give. She raised her prices twice that winter, and the demand did not slow. It grew, because the people who wanted what she had were not looking for cheap. They were looking for real. And there is always, her grandfather had known, a market for real, if you can survive long enough to reach the people who remember it. She survived the winter on the money from those first hogs, paid off the small debts she had, bought good bred stock to strengthen the line, and did not borrow $1. Verna approved. Verna did not say she approved, but she stopped bringing up sacks of feed and tinctures, which was how Della knew. It was the second winter that Harlan Dees came up the ridge. Della saw his truck from the barn, a new truck, big and quiet, and she watched it come up her gravel road and stop, and she did not go to meet it. She finished filling the trough she was filling, because a man who comes to you can wait until the animals are fed. When she came out of the barn, wiping her hands, Harlan was standing at the fence looking at the hogs the way everyone looked at them now, the way she had once looked at them in the sale barn corner, seeing something he had not expected to see. He was not a cruel man, Della had come to understand, only a conventional one, a man who had believed what everyone around him believed and had said it out loud with more confidence than the others. And now he stood at her fence with his cap in his hands, which was a thing men of his kind did not do lightly. He said her hogs were the talk of 2 counties. She said she'd heard something like that. He said his son had eaten at Cole's place and come home and asked why they didn't raise hogs that tasted like that, and Harlan had not had an answer. He looked at the herd for a while longer. "I ran that breed off my place 15 years ago," he said. "Told your grandfather he was a fool to keep them." He turned his cap in his hands. He didn't argue with me, just said, "We'll see." Harlan's mouth tightened. I figured that meant he had nothing to say. Della waited because she had learned to wait. "It didn't mean that," Harlan said finally. He set his cap back on his head, which meant the hard part was done. "I've got 40 acres of oak woods on the north side doing nothing," he said. "I was wondering if you'd have any interest in leasing them for your hogs come fall. There'd be no rush on the money." Della looked at the 40 acres in her mind, the room they would give her to grow, and then she looked at the man offering them, and she understood that this was his apology, delivered the only way a man like him could deliver it, as a business proposition instead of a confession. She said she'd think about it. She said, "I'll let you know how it goes." Harlan nodded and got in his big quiet truck and drove back down the ridge, and Della stood at the fence a long while after he was gone, thinking about her grandfather standing at this same fence saying, "We'll see," to a man who thought he'd won the argument and being right and never once needing to say so. She had been right too. She usually was, though she had gotten it, she knew, from him. She took the lease that fall, but she took it the way she took everything, slowly, small, no debt, running a portion of the herd on Harlan's oak ground and paying him from the proceeds and not before. And Harlan, who had spent his life growing by borrowing and getting big and watching his neighbors go under, watched her do it the other way and said nothing but watched closely. And Della suspected that within a few years there would be old breed hogs on the north side of Harlan Dees's place, finished en masse, sold under a name he would not have believed a year before. That was how it spread, not through her, but through the fact of what she had proven. The same way Cole's one dish had spread, the reality of the thing outrunning every argument that had been made against it. By the 3rd year, there were 2 other small farms in the county running heritage hogs, young people mostly, people who had gone away and come back the way she had, and they came up the ridge to ask her how she did it. and she showed them the notebooks, her grandfather's and her own, and she took them up the acorn ground, and she told them the same things Verna had told her: slow, small, no debt. Let them come to you. And she watched the knowledge move on the way it had moved to her, out of the past and into the present, out of a dead man's marbled composition books and into the hands of people who would keep it going. She did not get rich. That was never the shape of it. But she made a living, a real one, off ground the county had written off as not worth the trouble, and she made it doing work she understood was the continuation of something older than herself. And there is a kind of wealth in that which does not show up in a bank and does not need to. Verna died in the spring of the 4th year, quietly, in the narrow house with the metal roof, in the bed she had been born in, having lived her entire life within a mile of the place where that life began, which she had always regarded not as a limitation but as an accomplishment. Della found her in the morning, gone in her sleep, her work clothes folded on the chair by the bed the way she had folded them every night for 80 years. And Della sat with her a long time before she called anyone. Sat in the quiet with the woman who had given her the acorn ground and the tinctures and the single hardest sentence of praise she would ever receive: "You favor him." And she understood that a door had closed gently in a house where every door had always closed gently. They buried Verna next to Emmett on the ridge, in the small plot behind the house where 4 generations of renters lay, and half the county came, more than Della expected, men who had gone to the sale barn all their lives and had come, some of them, only to see the ridge everyone was talking about. And among them was Harlan Dees in a suit that did not fit him, standing at the back with his cap, for once, held properly in his hands. After the others had gone, Della walked up the acorn ground alone in the failing light, and the hogs came to her out of the trees the way they always did, unhurried, trusting, crooked in the lead with her responsible air, 4 years old now, and the mother of half the herd. And Della stood among them under the white oaks her great-great-grandfather had let stand for exactly this, and she let herself grieve quietly, the way everything on the ridge was done. She was not alone. She had the animals and the ground and the notebooks and the knowledge, and she had the 2 graves behind the house, and she understood that none of it belonged to her exactly, that she was only the one holding it now, the way Verna had held it and Emmett had held it, the way someone would hold it after her. In the fall of that 4th year, Della drove down to the county sale barn on the morning of the winter auction, the same auction where it had all begun, and she stood at the rail in her grandfather's canvas coat and watched the hogs come through. The place had changed and had not changed. There were still the fast pink hogs and the big operations and the men at the coffee urn, but there were other things now, too. A pen of heritage gilts brought in by one of the young farmers she had helped, drawing bids that would have been unthinkable 4 years before, and a hand-lettered sign on the office wall advertising Cole's restaurant, and the woman at the gas station down the road had a case now that sold Renner Ridge sausage, and the county had come slowly, without ceremony, back around to something it had spent 30 years walking away from. Harlan Dees found her at the rail. He had oak woods full of the old breed now, just as she had guessed, and he stood beside her watching the auction, and neither of them said much, which was how they both preferred it. Then a lot came through the ring that Della recognized, a pen of undersized piglets, culls, runts, the discarded ends of somebody's modern herd, whistling that thin kettle sound she had not forgotten, and the auctioneer asked for any bid at all, and the pen sat silent, and the men by the coffee urn did not laugh this time, because they had learned something. And into that silence a young woman Della did not know, thin through the shoulders, hardly more than a girl, raised one finger without raising her voice. The auctioneer said sold. Della watched the girl, who did not turn around, who stood looking at the piglets nobody wanted, with the particular stillness of a person who was seeing something the rest of the room could not, and Della felt something turn over in her chest, that was grief and gladness at once. Harlan followed her gaze. Somebody ought to tell that girl, he started to say, out of old habit, and then he stopped himself, and Della watched him stop, and he shook his head slowly and said instead, in a different voice, "She know what she's got." It was not a question. It was a fact, offered for consideration, and Della, who had once been that girl at that rail, said the only thing there was to say. "We'll see," she said, which was what her grandfather had said, which was what she had learned meant not, "I don't know, but I already know, and I will let the ground prove it, and I do not need to argue." The girl paid her dollars and signed her paper and went to figure out how to get the Piglets home in a truck too small for them. And Della, watching her go, understood that the thing Emmett had started and Verna had kept and she had proven was not hers to hold forever, that it was moving on again, out into new hands, the way it always had, the way it always would, and that this was not the end of anything. It was the far side of a circle, and it was going around again. If someone in your life has ever been told that what they have, or what they know, or who they are, isn't worth much, share this story with them, because the world is full of people standing at fences, seeing worth that everyone around them is too hurried to see, and they deserve to know they are not the only ones. Tell me in the comments about a time you were right about something everyone else dismissed, or about a thing you inherited that turned out to matter more than anyone expected, because those stories are the whole reason I tell these. And let me know where you're watching from, your town, your city, the ridge or the road, or the corner of the country you call home, because I read every single comment, all of them, and I like knowing you were here. The fat is the flavor. They will come back to it. Do not sell the line to a man who will cross it out. An old man wrote that in the margin of a notebook in the last year of his life, and he was talking about hogs, and he was talking about everything. The girl's truck pulled out of the sale barn lot with its first load of piglets crying in the bed, and Della stayed at the rail longer than she needed to, long after Harlan had gone to see about a load of feeder cattle, long after the auctioneer had moved on to the next lot. She was thinking about the truck, and about the 4 trips that girl would have to make, and about the 11 that would likely die in the first 10 days no matter what she did, and about the graves at the edge of the brush lot that felt like verdicts until they didn't. She was thinking that she could not save the girl any of it, the blistered hands or the sleepless weeks under the heat lamps or the arithmetic that would keep her awake, and that she should not want to, because those things were not obstacles on the way to the knowledge. They were the knowledge. You could not shortcut a person into understanding what a year of patience taught. But there was one thing she could do, and she found the girl a week later, tracked her down the way things get tracked in a small place, through the woman at the gas station who knew the girl had bought a played-out place over on Sattler Branch, 60 acres of brush and a barn with a good roof and a spring that ran clean, which was, Della thought, the only thing that mattered. She drove over on a gray afternoon with the ground beginning to freeze, and she found the girl in the barn with the piglets under a single heat lamp rigged from an extension cord, and Della stood at the door and watched for a while before she said anything, the way Emmett had taught her to watch, the way Verna had watched her. And she saw that the girl was doing it right, feeding small and often, sitting in the straw so the animals would trust her. And Della felt the thing turn over in her chest again. She introduced herself. The girl knew the name. Everyone knew the name now. Della did not make a production of it. She said she'd raised the same breed, or close to it, on ground not much different, and that she'd learned it from an old man's notebooks and an old woman's silence, and that if the girl ever wanted to know what to feed them, or where to find the acorn ground on her own place, because there was always acorn ground if you knew how to look, she should come up the ridge. The girl asked why she'd help a competitor. Della thought about that. She thought about Verna saying more that would, if somebody made it worth remembering. "It's not a competition," she said finally. "There's more people wanting real than either of us can feed. The more of us there are, the more of them there'll be. That was arithmetic the county had never taught, and the girl looked at her the way Della had once looked at Verna, waiting to see if it was true. "It's true," Della said, as if the girl had asked out loud. "I'll let you know how it goes," the girl said, which made Della smile, because it was exactly what she would have said, and she understood the girl had learned it somewhere too, from somebody, the way it moved. Before she left, Della took something from her coat pocket and set it on the barn's workbench. It was a composition book, marbled black and white, the rubber band around it still good. It was not one of Emmett's. It was one of her own, the first year's February. Through the following winter, the waits and the weather and the 11 deaths, and the day Cole drove up the ridge and said the word Ossabaw. "Start your own," Della said, "but that one's yours to read first." The girl picked it up and did not open it, just held it, the way Della had held the honey jar the day she met Verna, understanding it was an offering and not yet knowing how much. Della drove home in the truck that still dictated its will on the hills, and she did not look back, because there was nothing to look back at, only a girl in a barn on Sattler Branch doing the same slow work in the same failing light, and the work would carry itself now whether Della watched or not. That was the point of it. That had always been the point of it. Emmett had not needed to win the argument with Harlan, because the ground would win it for him, in its own time, long after both of them were gone, and it had. Verna had not needed praise because the doing was the thing, and the doing continued. Della drove up her own ridge in the dark, and the hogs were shapes moving on the far slope under a rind of moon, and the 2 graves were behind the house, and the notebooks were on the kitchen table, and the girl on Sattler Branch was reading, by lamplight, a stranger's account of a year that would tell her she was not the only one who had ever stood at a rail and seen Worth where the whole room saw waste. Della fed the animals and went inside and sat down at the table and opened her current notebook to write the day's entry, the weather, the count, and at the bottom, after the figures, she wrote one more line, the way her grandfather had written the lines that mattered, and underlined it once. "It's going around again," she wrote, and it was.